Assassin's Creed Black Flag is an interesting game. It's a game that bears the title of Assassin's Creed, but doesn't feel like it belongs to it exactly. This is not a game to get the assassin fantasy like the Ezio trilogy. Black Flag decides to leave all of the conventional AC elements in the dirt and chart its own path. This is not your typical Assassin's Creed game. It's so much better. Black Flag is a pirate game, period. The story does still involve assassins, but not to the extent that the previous games did, which is probably something you've noticed with the newer games too, but this game takes a serious shift from the games that came before, which does leave it feeling a bit out of place in the franchise. But that doesn't make the game bad at all. I feel like this game is in the same boat as Assassin's Creed Odyssey, a really enjoyable game for what it is, but not what one would expect from the AC franchise. Now, in terms of time, this was actually the last AC game I've played because of the things I heard about it. It was supposedly one of, if not the best, Assassin's Creed games of all time. So, I decided to play it last in order to end the series on a high note. And damn, the people who said it was good weren't lying. But that doesn't mean the game doesn't have any problems either. The mission structure is probably the worst in the series, the hand-to-hand combat is tremendously subpar, and the gameplay loop can get extremely repetitive. However, I think the pros of the game outweigh the cons by a lot. I don't think Black Flag is the best game ever made, nor the best AC game, but it certainly is one of my favorites. Finally, I have to mention that there will be minor story spoilers in this review, so feel free to click off if you wanted to go into the game blind, but obviously this is a decade-old game, most of you are going to know how it ends. But alas, let's get into my review of Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. Black Flag came swinging right out of the gate with the pirate theme, and it was not ashamed of it. Pirates and assassins seem to be both perfect parallels of each other and at the same time diametrically opposed. Pirates are free to do whatever they want, sail, plunder, and live life on the edge. And what do the assassins fight for? Freedom. Simultaneously, pirates murder and pillage for their own game at the cost of everyone else, the opposite of the assassin mission. And that is why Edward Kenway is the perfect candidate for the main character. He's selfish, arrogant, and, well, an ass. He's a pirate. He is the perfect player character for this story to take place in. An outsider to the Assassin-Templar conflict who must pick a side, be that out of greed or purpose. The story of Black Flag is not the story of a rising assassin as we've seen in the last 4 games. Kenway is not an assassin, at least not until the end anyway. Sure, Edward may side with them, but his journey is not for them. His journey is done for himself and for money. The dichotomy between Edward's journey and the assassin's life is in full force, and that is why this game works so well. It's relatable. Not everyone can understand their entire family being murdered like in the Ezio trilogy, or watching our mother and family burn alive like in 3. But there is one thing that most of us can relate to in some capacity or another. Love and money. Because at the end of the day, that's what Edward's story boils down to. The focus isn't on some grand scheme to take over the world by brainwashing the masses. It's a much more intimate tale about a man who just wants to make a living. And that's why I think Edward Kenway is one of the best protagonists in any AC games to date. He's a relatable hero who makes mistakes, messes up, but most importantly, learns to recover from them. He's a sympathetic person who most people can understand because he is both the best and worst parts of ourselves. His goals are understandable and short-sighted, but I mean, who doesn't want to be rich? Black Flag takes the central ideal of being a pirate and connects it to the assassin ideology. A person who is truly free on the seas, but at the same time robs it from others. Edward's character arc is one of the best I've ever seen. If anything, I would put him behind characters like Joel Miller, Kratos, and Jin Sakai. What's also one of the best things that I've ever seen is the Caribbean. The Caribbean is absolutely beautifully recreated in this game. from the high seas to the islands that are inside of it. Yes, the game does look very dated, but the effect is still the same. You don't need good graphics to enjoy the wonderful world that Ubisoft created. The feeling of traversing the waves is secondhand to absolutely nothing. Traveling by ship shouldn't be fun or entertaining, it should just be pointing the Jackdaw in the direction that you want to go, but there is something about seeing the ship bouncing up and down with the waves that brings an odd sense of peace that you wouldn't expect from such a force of nature. Adding to the ship's majesty is the sea shanties. If there's one thing that will stick with you after playing the game, it's the sea shanties. The singers of these songs do a masterful job at creating these. The songs make you feel like you are part of this band of pirates, and it makes you feel like you really belong on the crew with the Jackdaw. Sailing on the open ocean is such a wonderful experience. Seeing the floating fortresses on the horizon, hearing the water up against the hull, and the joy of the crew just adds to the pirate's fantasy. But notice how there is nothing here to add about the assassin fantasy. And that's because at the end of the day, this game didn't care about being an Assassin's Creed game when separated from the story. It wanted to be a pirate game, and it exceeds at that. The thing that separates this game apart from all of the other games that came before it is its central focus on the ocean and naval combat. Black Flag went for one of the largest AC maps of all time, and it held that title up until 2018 with the release of Odyssey. Somehow, despite the large size, the game never feels like it's too large for its own good. It simultaneously is filled to the brim with exciting and unique content, but it doesn't ever get boring, even taking into account the massive size of the map. Black Flag really sticks to quality over quantity. Yes, I'm aware that there are a lot of collectibles and really minor things to do, along with like map uncoverings, treasure chests, but those aren't really a core part of Black Flag. And if anything, I should know I 100%ed the game. There are cookie-cutter missions such as the Outpost Raid, which have Edward silently infiltrate a compound with valuable materials in it. Edward will then have to sneak around the area until he finds the key to the door with the valuables behind it using eagle vision. Whether you decide to go in guns or stealth, Edward will have to look for the key to open the warehouse. This is probably the most generic activity that you will have to do. You really only get Jackdaw materials from this, and that's fine, but where the game really shines is when it involves water. My favorite activities are the diving bell explorations. There are certain locations that the Jackdaw can pull up to which have hidden shipwrecks just below the waves. Edward will then descend in his diving bubble to get all of the materials and money left down there. This activity is tense. Not tense in the same way tailing missions are, but these have a tinge of horror to them. The unpredictability of the waves is unparalleled when Edward is diving, because unlike on land, you are not the dominant life form, and you are not supposed to be there. The main cause of this constant anxiety you'll feel is from the sharks. Everywhere around the shipwrecks, Edward will need to avoid sharks at all times or risk being mauled to death. The sharks have the same sort of alert system as standard enemies do, but being defenseless makes it so much more terrifying. It's like that feeling in a game when you are disarmed and have to stealth around enemies or the mission fails. It's kinda like the mission Alone in Modern Warfare 2. Only this time, crank it up to 1,000, because this time, it's Mother Nature trying to kill you. I don't play horror games because 1, I'll shit myself, and 2, I like my heart being at 60 beats per minute when I'm sitting down. And if this couldn't get any more horrifying, Edward also has to watch out for one more thing, his oxygen. Not only do you have to keep into account how far away the next loot chest is, your relative position to the different sea creatures, but you also have to think about how low your oxygen is and how far away the closest oxygen bucket is, and also how long it will take you to reach it in a pickle. There is so much going on in this game at a single time, and that's what makes the diving bell activities the best part of the side content. I don't like these activities because of how stressful they are, but I love them because they do exactly what they are meant to do. But there is one more main attraction to the high seas: fortresses. These forts hold key areas in the Caribbean, and they do not take kindly to pirates. Make the mistake of bringing the Jackdaw too close, and you'll end up in a watery grave. Taking on a high level 4 is only something the most talented of captains can do. You have to dodge mortar strikes, place well-timed shots into the cannon walls, and watch the whole thing crumble. All of this is done in conjunction to fighting enemy ships that have been called to support against the legendary Jacka. But first, in order to take one of these down, you have to know how to operate the Jacka. You have to master all of its bells and whistles before you can call yourself a master assassin, or for that matter, ruler of the seven seas. The Jackdaw is a complicated piece of machinery to get used to, and you'll need to do it pretty fast. The ship has several different attacks: round shot, heavy shot, chain shot, mortars, and fire barrels, swivel guns, and a ram. All have their own pros and cons, and mastery is necessary to take on your foes. Round shot is going to be the weapon you use the most. It has range, accuracy, and unlimited ammo. It's your all-rounder. The chain shot can only be fired from the front of the ship. Its damage is minimal, but it's used to slow down enemy ships for a short period by wrapping around its mast. But here's where it gets interesting. The heavy shots trade range for massive amounts of power, meaning you have to get close in order to use it. High risk, high reward. You have to close the gap to the enemy and, most likely, take some damage doing it. Mortars cover a large area of effect and deal a massive amount of damage. The only problem is that these shots take much longer to land than usual. You now have to do a lot more prediction when placing these shots, because if you miss, the long reload time will certainly screw you over. Fire barrels can be launched off of the stern of the ship. These are the most situational because they typically only come into play when running away from a fight or when an enemy is extremely close behind. The ram acts as well a ram. You can set full speed ahead and smash straight into your enemies. The final addition is the swivel gun, which adds a surprising amount of depth into the combat. Shooting an enemy's hull with the round shot or heavy shot will expose its gunpowder reserves. Edward can quickly take advantage of this and blow the ship up from the inside out. And here's where the strategy comes in. These will only become exposed when the hull is hit, not the sails. In-game, hitting the sails does the same thing as hitting the hull, except for exposing these barrels. There might be other differences, but from what I can tell, it's really just that. And now, it might sound weird to say that hitting the hull is the best way to deal damage, because, well, obviously, but I wouldn't be telling you this if it didn't add to anything. The main challenge is that the enemy ship is not always going to be visible to the Jackdaw. The waves are merciless in the Indies. If you aim too low, they will eat all of the cannon fire and force you to wait for a reload and be at the mercy of your adversary. Situational awareness is extremely important in this game because of how fast the Seven Seas change and move. Storms can be kicked up at any moment, and with them comes trouble, and a lot of fun. When the wind get high, so do the waves. The Jackdaw and the enemy ship will start bobbing up and down constantly with the waves, which makes strategizing even more essential. If you lose your rounds at the wrong time, it might just lead to them getting eaten up by a swell you didn't see coming, and subject you to the horribly long reload time. In this time period, the enemy can do anything to you while you'll be defenseless, but not unless you're quick enough. If you pay enough attention to your surroundings, you can actually duck behind oncoming waves or ships and completely avoid a hit. It creates an actual skill gap that separates beginners from the experts. You aren't just winning because you upgraded your ship more, you're also winning because you know how to play smart. And the waves aren't the only way to play smart. Many times in the game, you'll be engaged in single combat with a ship before another one enters the fray and starts attacking. This is where the fun begins. The Jackdaw has 3 different sailing types: half, full, and travel, and these all dictate how fast the ship can go at any given time. Half being the slowest and travel being the fastest, but the faster sails also impact your turn speed and make it much more challenging to successfully maneuver the Jackdaw. Maneuvering the Jackdaw is just another way to separate the beginners from the pros. A good captain will be able to force other ships to be at its mercy with the way you move your ship. You can't let yourself get surrounded or else you risk this happening to you. The trick is learning how to avoid that. You can keep both of them at long distance, charge in for hit and runs, or engage in mid-range combat with all the enemy ships. There is an endless opportunity for creativity and skill in this game. There really is no right or wrong way to fight on the Seven Seas. Matter of fact, if you're good enough, you can do exactly what Beckett did, except you can be the one to come out on top. If you go in the middle of 2 ships and fire each side's cannons one after another, It effectively bypasses reload times and can effectively lead you to deal double the damage that you originally would have done. This is what makes Black Flag's combat so deep. The constant changing and interchangeable environments around the Jackdaw. On paper, most interactions should just be an aim and shoot until they're dead, but it's really not with this game. There are so many factors in play at any given time that every single combat encounter feels fresh and new, and that's why I think this game feels so good even to this day. Quite a while ago, I mentioned the fortresses that you can find in the world. These are large military fortifications that usually sit on bottlenecks in the game or just on random islands. These fortresses require Kenway to blow up all of the fortress defenses with the Jackdaw's cannons while simultaneously fighting off all of the enemy ships in the area. Remember what I said about situational awareness? Yeah, here's where that comes into play. The fortress will shoot back at you, and the only way to get it to stop is to destroy the weapons it is using. You have to balance the enemy ships, fortress, and individual weapons inside of it in order to actually succeed. These fortress assaults are great, and they end with Kenway getting inside and killing all of the soldiers inside of it. This part is a bit underwhelming for reasons I can get to in a second, but it shows to emphasize just how good the ship combat can be and how it can still hold up until today. But there is a bit of a sour stain on this game's legacy, and that's going to be boarding and hand-to-hand combat, which you see during all ship boardings and fortress assaults. Shipboarding is a pretty intuitive idea. Damage a ship enough to board it and kill the crew in return, earning some materials and healing the Jackdaw in the middle of the fight. I think it fits the same kind of idea as Doom's Glory Kill, because it encourages aggression in order to stay in the fight for just a little bit longer. The only problem is that this can get extremely repetitive and can break up the otherwise brilliant ship combat. Boarding will see Kenway and his crew leap onto an enemy ship and kill 10 to 20 of the ship's crew depending on its size and class. There will be a few additional objectives such as blowing up ammo barrels or cutting down a ship's flag, but these change depending on what kind of ship you're boarding. Essentially, the larger the ship, the longer a boarding takes. These can range from anywhere between 1 to 5 minutes, which again depends on the type of ship being boarded. The problem with this, other than the constant repetition mentioned earlier, is that the combat system in this game is not very good. Now, if you watched my AC3 review from well over 2 years ago, which most of you probably haven't because it has like 50 views, you'll know that I absolutely loved the combat system in that game. I thought it was fast-paced, exciting, and all-around fun to play with. But this time, it isn't the case, despite the combat system being literally exactly the same. It lacks a crucial part that 3 had, and that's enemies. Both in cities and on ships, the game lacks the same sort of enemy population that the previous game had. The problem with this is that Edward never really feels like quite the badass his grandson is, and it comes across in gameplay. In 3, fights could last anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes if you don't decide to run because of the way enemy patrols work, and how they would spawn in whenever Connor gets in a fight. But in Black Flag, this never happens. The most enemies you will typically fight is like 5. Compare this to 3, when you can get into a fight with like 30 soldiers and come out on top. It just doesn't feel the same because in both games, combat is ridiculously easy, but what made 3 fun was how many enemies there were to fight. In Black Flag, it just feels kinda sad because of how quickly Edward can mop the floor with them. You might think that this would get remedied during shipboardings, but this isn't really the case unfortunately. When Edward boards a ship, so does his crew, which means that despite having to kill 20 enemies in a man-o-war, most of them get preoccupied with your crewmates and never actually come after Edward himself. 2 or 3 may fight you, but after you kill them, you have to go initiate one-on-one combat with someone else who is already fighting your crew. The combat in this game just doesn't feel very good or satisfying, and it just comes across as rather clunky. Unlike naval combat, hand-to-hand combat doesn't have any variety. There's 3 types of enemies, and you can never get to fight more than expected. If there's 5 enemies on screen when you initiate a fight, chances are there will always be 5 enemies until they are all dead. There's no element of surprise and unpredictability like in the previous game. This problem is exacerbated due to another big issue, and that's the fact that there's only one weapon in this game, the dual swords. Yep, that's right, coming off of a game that had boarding axes, maces, knives, and hatchets, we only get swords. This is just beyond weird to me. I had expected this for a game like Rogue, which is essentially just a glorified Black Flag DLC, but for some reason this AAA entry into the Assassin's Creed series only has one main weapon choice. It's even weirder because you can pick up weapons from felled foes. You can pick up an enemy's rifle, heavy axe, or short sword and use it. All of these come with their own unique animations, so the only thing on my mind is why can't we equip these on our own? Because this requires you to kill someone to get it, and as soon as you start climbing something you lose the weapon, I genuinely don't know why we can't have these weapons as a part of our permanent arsenal. It's a bizarre design choice to only have Edward be able to equip the swords. One redeeming quality of the combat in this game is that it has the pistols. Now, 3 does have pistols, but you can't hold as many of them or use them for any specific purpose other than killing an enemy faster or killing an enemy that you can't kill chain. In Black Flag, if you have 3 or 4 pistols equipped and spam the shoot button, Edward will rapidly fire all 4 guns at the enemies around him and stagger them. This doesn't auto-kill enemies for some reason, even though a normal quickfire does, but it can be useful for taking out brutes or captains that can block your attacks normally. It also can only be used once realistically in a single combat encounter because of the obscenely long reload it takes to actually do all 4, which does make sense historically. I've actually fired a musket and reloaded one in real life several times, and yeah, these things are a pain in the ass to use. The animations used in the game are actually unrealistically fast, because on average it takes like 30 seconds to a minute to actually reload it and be able to fire. Tangent aside, the guns in Black Flag do at least have some unique functionality, but I think that this needed to be expanded on just a little bit more in order to make these fully fleshed out. Having multiple button combinations to chain melee attacks and range attacks seamlessly could have been really interesting, similar to the range chain kill from 3 except with the ability to add more kills to it. It is really sad to say, but melee combat in this game is just really boring and repetitive. Fortunately, the game's other systems are competent enough to leave the player with an enjoyable experience overall. So, another feature that makes a return from 3 is going to be hunting. Now, I won't get too much into it, but it essentially works the exact same way as in that game. You can stalk prey, set traps, or go guns blazing into the wilderness of the Caribbean in order to get what you want. This remains virtually unchanged except for the animals you can hunt. Instead of the animals from the American frontier, Edward finds himself among tropical animals like monkeys and iguanas. Hunting is decent in this game, but I find it easier to just buy whatever I needed from the nearest shop rather than go out and scavenge for it. The last thing I want to focus on in this video is one of my personal favorite aspects of this game, and this is the legendary ship battles you can find yourself in. There are several ships around the map that get the classification of a legendary ship, even higher than a man of war. This shows Black Flag's ship combat in all of its glory. These are 1v1 cage matches where you are stuck in a fight to the death. Each ship has a unique gimmick that makes them feel different from the other man-of-wars and each other. The twin ships, the Royal Sovereign and the HMS Fearless, are 2 extremely powerful floating fortresses that can double team you extremely easily. Remember how I said earlier you could use going in between the 2 ships to use your advantage? Well, that won't work this time. They both have such an insane amount of firepower, it's going to be a challenge to destroy them in general. And if you try picking them off one by one and engaging with the other once its sister ship is destroyed, you'll be in for a surprise. As soon as one of them goes down, the other spontaneously gets a damage buff and starts acting much more unpredictable. Its speed also increases, which makes it a nightmare to fight against. Going against this one ship is probably going to be harder than going against both at the same time. You have to make sure that you are only damaging them equally, because if you allow one to die while the other is only at half health, you basically just screwed yourself over and you might as well just restart the fight. The only way you can do this is if you perfectly balance your damage output so that both of them go down seconds after each other. Taking any longer will leave you at risk of getting immediately clobbered by the surviving ship. Another legendary ship is the HMS Prince, which does not have any real gimmick like the other ones, but makes up for it in its atmosphere. The ghost ship will periodically dip into the fog and leave the player blind to its actions, and can sometimes only be seen when there is a crash of thunder. The aesthetics of this fight is absolutely insane, and while lacking in function, makes up for it so well in style. La Dama Negra's feature is its extremely powerful mortars and absolutely impenetrable hull. You can't shoot through the front or sides of the ship due to it being an ironclad, so what you have to do is navigate behind it to do any effective damage. The challenge for the ship is the navigation element of it, because of the careful considerations you have to make. Coupling this with the increased mortar damage and usage means that La Dama Negra never even needs to look at you in order to kill you. This fight is all about movement and positioning. The final of the four, which I personally found the hardest, was El Impoluto. I don't know how to say that actually because I don't speak Spanish. This ship scares the shit out of me because in every other fight, the Jackdaw is always the fastest ship in play at any given time. Unfortunately for you, El Impoluto outclasses it by a lot. This ship relies heavily on its forward-facing cannons and its rams. Even if you try to run away, it will catch you and it will destroy you. All four of these legendary battles operate amazingly and each function differently in their own unique way. It requires the player to gain a true mastery of positioning and all of the different aspects of ship combat in order to even stand a chance at this. These fights are genuinely amazing and despite taking a lot of tries to get through, are well worth the time. Something else that makes these fights even better is the soundtrack. The soundtrack to Black Flag is one of the best I've ever listened to. It has this feeling of epicness and adventure that just feels so good all of the time. From the exciting scenes to the quiet and heartfelt ones, this game has it all. And now that this review is winding down, you've probably realized that I haven't said anything that's really about assassins. I haven't mentioned any stealth or really anything assassin related except for the story. And that's because this game is kind of not an Assassin's Creed game. It has the assassins, it has the ideology, but the gameplay is not focused on being an assassin. This game is focused on being a pirate, and I think that's what I love so much about this game. It's not focused on the assassin fantasy. I mean, there's a lot of games that do, and I really like those games, but Black Flag is not trying to divide its attention between two things. It is very concise in what it's trying to be, which is a very good pirate game. And that's why I don't really feel like Black Flag is that much of an Assassin's Creed game. It's really more of a pirate game wearing a trench coat. And I think it is one of the best pirate games of all time. It's very, very good. The assassin stuff really complements everything that happens in the game. It is more of a backdrop than the actual story, which is really what I like. And I know a lot of other fans really like this as well, because this game is considered one of the best Assassin's Creed games, despite it being an Assassin's Creed game that many people don't consider to be a real Assassin's Creed game. The way that the narrative and Edward's character complement the Assassin-Templar conflict is just perfected in my opinion. It's what makes the game so great. Black Flag shed its identity of being an AC game, and it created one of the best pirate games, well, of all time. The ship combat, the beautiful world Ubisoft created, and the wonderful gameplay just all work in tandem with each other to create one of the best gaming experiences I have ever felt. And I know a lot of fans feel the same way. And that, my friends, is the reason why Black Flag will go down as one of my favorite games of all time.